Well, Michael, thank you very much for spending some time telling us about Jubilee Centre's research component, which has been a really important part of what we've done over the years. And obviously you founded Jubilee Centre back in 1983, and it is a research-based organisation. So can you tell us, why is research so important in the task of biblical social transformation, and maybe give one or two examples of the difference that good research can make?
I suppose we started the Jubilee Centre as a small research group in the back of my house many years ago. And then what happened was somebody asked for a comment on Mrs. Thatcher's proposal to deregulate Sunday shopping. So I started to look into it. So is this research? Well, just finding out the facts, who'd be affected, when would it come in, what was the legal form of it going to be, how it would affect shop workers, all those sorts of basic things, and wrote a brief report. And then later on came a calling to really get involved. So the first step was to ask the question, as a Christian, why did I think Sunday should be kept a special day? Is this just an Old Testament, Sabbatarian kind of revision? Doesn't the New Testament say we don't need to worry about days of the week? What did Jesus think about Sundays? How does he behave towards the Sabbath? Does he treat it seriously? Does he actually follow the Sabbath in his life or not? All those kinds of questions. So the first step was to say, well, if we're going to run a campaign against Mrs. Thatcher on the issue of Sunday trading, can we really defend that from a Christian point of view, or have we got to make a purely secular argument? What's the basis of appeal to Christians to support this? So I had a very able researcher working with me at the time called Chris Townsend, and I got him to write a paper, gave him a bit of help, so I got my name on the front of it, but we wrote a paper called Why Keep Sunday Special, which was looking first of all at the biblical argument, Old and New Testament. But after that, we wanted to look at the rest of the arguments. So, well, if it's only going to affect 5 shop workers in the whole of the country, why are we bothered about it? You know, it doesn't matter if 5 extra people have to work for everyone else's convenience. But of course, it's millions of people who work in shops and distribution and all the rest of it who'd be involved in this. Would it be confined to shops, or would it involve banks and estate agents and other public services? Would it extend into sport? So how many people could potentially get caught up in Sunday working of one kind or another if this is to go through? Does it affect the police, the fire brigade, all the rest of it? We needed some facts on that. And then also, how would it affect different parts of the retail sector? Was this going to benefit big shops as well as small shops? Was it going to be big shops at the expense of small shops? Would it affect the high street as much as it affected the out of town? So who wanted this? Who was really pushing for it, and why? And how did that affect then our response as Christians? If this was actually a move by big shops to try and get market share away from small shops, as I believe actually it was, particularly in the food sector, then doesn't that influence the way we respond to it as Christians? Who uses small shops? Well, if small shops are used by old people and people with disabilities and so on, because they find it hard to get to the big out-of-town Tesco or Asda supermarkets, then wouldn't that influence how we responded to the issue? So collecting those background facts was critically important to how and whether we launched a campaign to do something about it.
Yeah, so actually that you're saying then that the research changes what appears initially to be a rather simple question, oh, should shops open on Sunday or not, actually into, you've found out the true complexity that lies behind that question. And I suppose it's really important that as Christians, if we're going to propose something, a change, that we have thought it through properly.
Yes, either propose or oppose a change being brought by the government or by anybody else. We need to really understand the arguments and be ready in the media to defend the point of view that we have. So imagine you hadn't done that research and you did go on the television, you're running this campaign, Keep Sunday Special, and somebody says, well, actually, only 500 shop workers are going to be affected by this, so what's the problem? And you've never looked at that question, you never thought about it. you'd be gobsmacked, and then you'd look very stupid.
Yeah.
It isn't just a matter of looking stupid, it's a matter of having wasted your time on something that was actually unimportant.
Yes, and also when people say, you're only doing this because you're Christians, you want to go to church on Sunday. So
Yes, that's
how
right.
do
You
you
then have
counter
to...
that? How can
Yes.
you show that it's for the public good, if you like?
Yes, I think that's another very important angle, because there is a question as to whether one is campaigning on the legitimate grounds of saying, well, the big shops are arguing for it, frankly, because they want to make more money. Let's be honest about it. Let's not pull punches. They're not interested in consumer freedom of choice. They're actually interested because they think they can increase their profits. Let's call a spade a spade. But then we also need to be prepared as Christians to call a spade a spade. Are we arguing for this purely because we believe it's important people can come to church, in which case we should say so? That's the reason. We believe the Bible says so, and we want people to come to church. Or are we concerned about the welfare of low-income people who are going to be the ones who are made to work on a Sunday? In fact, the Bible points to that in Deuteronomy 5. It says, you were slaves in Egypt, therefore, keep the Sabbath holy. Well, why is it relevant to say they were slaves in Egypt? Well, because if you're a slave, you work 7 days a week.
Yeah.
So
And it also said in that very verse, in the Ten Commandments, that not only should you not work on the Sunday, but nor your men servants or your maid servants or your donkeys or whatever. It made it absolutely clear that it's for everyone, that no one should be exploited for just so you could have a Sabbath.
Yes. Actually, there are two passages that deal with this. The one in Exodus talks about the family and the fact that your men servants and maid servants shouldn't work. The only category that's omitted, of course, I'm sure you know, is the wife. There's no mention of the wife not working, and people sometimes say to me, well, is the Bible saying, well, women can work and men shouldn't? But of course, when it says you shall not work on the Sabbath day, the you is both addressed to men and to women. It's not just addressed to men.
Yeah.
And people forget that the Ten Commandments are addressed to women as much as they're addressed to men. Anyway, we're going off on a tangent.
Yeah. Give us, you talked about the Sunday trading, the Sunday Keep Sunday Special campaign as an example of a project that really benefited from a good research base. Can you give another example of a project like that Jubilee Centre has been involved in?
Can I give a historical example first,
Yeah.
perhaps? The Wilberforce campaign against slavery, which I think we would all want to endorse and recognise as a huge Christian contribution historically. The campaign was won in significant part due to the work of somebody called Thomas Clarkson, and he was responsible for the research aspect of the campaign. So he would endlessly and tirelessly pursue the facts. So how many people were being transported across from West Africa to, let's say, the West Indies or North America? How many of them died on the way? How many people were squeezed into one of these slave ships? What were conditions like on the slave ships? When they got to the West Indies, how were they treated? Were they well treated? Were they looked after? Were they fed and watered? Or were they treated harshly, whipped, given inadequate food? Were they allowed to marry or not? All those kinds of questions were looked into by Thomas Clarkson. And his ability to produce all of those facts and to illustrate them with pictures and diagrams and so on was hugely influential. And then getting the accounts of the slaves themselves, getting their stories, getting them published and circulated. All of that built up the public view that slavery was wrong and unacceptable. And it's often the major benefit of a campaign is the argument that goes on around it. And as you develop the arguments, as you demonstrate why these things are so important, you're changing the public mind and mood and mindset. And that's what really brings the change in society long term. So it took 25 years, roughly, from the moment when Wilberforce started his campaign to when in 1807 he managed to abolish by law in Parliament the slave trade. And then it took another 25 years to the time when slavery itself was abolished. So this campaign took 25 years or 50 years, depending on how you look at it, But that was what gave the church such credibility in the 19th century and led to so many people, I believe, becoming Christians. Because suddenly the church and the Bible were relevant and immediate and credible.
Great. Take us to another example, because these historical ones are so inspirational. What about in the last 20 years, for example, the City Life initiative? Tell us about that and the research element, how that contributed to it.
So, City Life, which is now called ALLIA, ALLIA, it's a wonderful website, it's worth a visit. The City Life work began with a desire to tackle unemployment in the UK. So there were questions then about, well, how many people are unemployed? And what's their age profile, their skills profile? Who are these people? And what problems have they got getting jobs? Why are they finding it difficult to find jobs? And what sorts of things could be done to help them? So the biblical mandate to help the unemployed was not difficult to extract from the Bible, in the sense that God is so compassionate and concerned for vulnerable and needy people. And in a sense, you didn't need to make the argument much beyond that. You didn't have to look for verses that particularly applied to unemployment, although there are passages, for example, in Deuteronomy that talk about leaving the corners of the field for certain categories of people, like the orphans and the widows and so on, who'd find it difficult to have work otherwise, to be able to have some work and to earn, if you like, their welfare provision to some degree. So the question was then, who are these unemployed people and how should we go about it? Now, where we had quite an issue on the research side was where you might not expect it. So, all right, we thought, well, let's issue a bond, that is a financial instrument, which will guarantee to pay you the money back at the end of, say, 5 years. Because we thought people don't want to give money to help the unemployed. It just seems like a sink. It's such a big issue, it needs so much money, and the little bit that I give is not going to make a difference. And also, we're already giving all the money we have. If we could tap into, for example, people's pension provision and get them to give, or rather lend some money for 5 years, where we would guarantee to give the money back, but we would use the interest over those 5 years from the money, and these were years back in the 90s when the interest rate was maybe 5% or something like that. It meant something. Lots of people might be willing to lend some money on that basis, knowing that they could get it back if they needed to. But how would you do that? If you set up a limited company to do it, to issue these bonds, they'd come under 6,000 pages of regulation from the financial regulation authorities in the City of London, and you'd be so buried under paper and cost and regulation and restrictions on who could sell it and to whom and what training they needed and all the rest of it, you'd just never get started. And this was only going to be probably for, a few thousand, maybe a few tens of thousands of people. This wasn't going to be about millions of people and zillions of pounds. This was, in a sense, relatively small fry, but the regulations have to be followed by everybody. However, by doing some legal research work, we were able to uncover the fact that there was a financial institution that you're allowed to set up, which is relatively unregulated. It's called an Industrial and Provident Society, and we established City Life as an Industrial and Provident Society because it didn't fall under all of the regulations that were designed for a purely commercial approach to issuing new financial instruments like bonds. So that was another example of research, not so much on the social and economic circumstances of the unemployed, which was actually quite well documented, but on what legal form could you use if you wanted to enable the residents of a city like Sheffield to put some money into tackling unemployment in their own city. What was the legal form which would allow you to do that? Obviously, within certain parameters, we understood that. That's obvious and necessary to protect the investor, but allow you to do it in a way that didn't completely smother you with regulation.
Well, you've been doing this for a long time now, so I wonder if you would see if you could sum up, perhaps in 2 or 3 principles for somebody who has got a real heart for engaging in some issue of injustice or something in society that they feel God's leading them to get involved in or to change. How would you advise them to approach this whole question of getting the research done properly so it's a well-researched initiative? What sort of steps could you recommend?
So I would say there are probably three aspects to that. The first is just to make sure that you're on solid ground biblically. So I would want the person who was going to launch some kind of initiative like this to do some careful biblical reflection. So to look at, well, what kind of teaching is there in the Bible that relates to the issue at hand? How has that been interpreted and understood by people who work in the area of theology and biblical exposition and so on? How does it fit in with the wider aspects of biblical teaching? Because all the different parts of a social and economic system are interconnected. And in particular, look at the issue through a relational lens. The Bible is very insistent. Jesus insists that loving God and loving neighbor it's on those two laws that all the rest of the law depends, and love is a quality of relationship. So one needs to think about how this particular issue you're interested in affects relationships in a whole range of spheres, both between people and God and between people and people. So that biblical work is the first step. The second step is to say, well, let's look at this issue on the ground and look at what the facts are. So let's say you're looking at the trading of women for sex or something like that. So you'd want to know, well, how many people are involved with this? Which countries are they coming from? Who is doing it? What kinds of restrictions exist at the moment already? What kinds of regulations prevent it? Who is trying to prevent it? Who else is out there trying to do something about it? Is a campaign by Christians or by us really necessary as an additional initiative? Is there some corner of this field that we should focus on rather than trying to tackle the whole thing at once? Because that part of it may be, I don't know, women from the Philippines or something is a relatively neglected part of the story. All of those kinds of questions would give you an idea about whether, if you started this, someone was going to come up tomorrow and say, well, why have you started this? Because I'm already doing it. Or it's already covered by 25 different agencies already. We don't need another one. Go and join one of the existing ones. So before you start something, you need to be really sure what's out there, both in terms of the problem itself, who's doing stuff, and also how big an issue is it really? I mean, if you are dealing with 3 people who are short of water in Ethiopia, perhaps there are 10 million people short of water, you know, next door in Somalia, and you should be thinking about the 10 million and not the 3 kind of argument. But the third area, and it's sort of what I've just been saying sort of feeds into this, is that there is an element of simply wisdom. There are so many needs in the world, and the ones that we might take on are partly a matter of personal calling. Has the Lord laid this on your heart? And therefore, if he has, then clearly you need to respond to that. But there is also an element of discernment involved, and that depends on your knowledge of the Lord and his will and purposes, and it depends partly on your practical experience and sort of knowledge of the wider world in which we live, which depends on whether you are somebody who engages with, you know, reading what the press is saying over a period of time, so that you have a sense of where the world is at the moment, and of wisdom which comes mainly from knowing the Lord, but also from a knowledge of the context. As John Stott used to say, you know, spend as much time reading the newspaper as you spend reading the Bible. I mean, you need to know both sides to be able to apply the Bible to the world. You need to know both what's in the Bible and what's in the world. It says in Isaiah, of the servant, referring to, as we know now, Christ, that by his knowledge he brought righteousness to many. So by his knowledge, well, I think that's the knowledge that he had of God, of his intentions and purposes, and it was through his knowledge that he understood the need to die as a sacrifice, and he also understood that he would be given life again after the grave. Jesus predicted his resurrection. How did he do that? When he did it because of his knowledge of God's word and his purposes. So I think this wisdom element is important, and therefore there is a kind of long-term investment to be made in getting to know the Lord and getting to know the Bible really well, cover to cover, reading it over and over again, just getting familiar with it. Now, I don't want to say by that here is a guy who's 21, who's just come out of university, who has a passion to get involved and do something, and saying, well, no, don't start for 30 years, you know. You need the wisdom first. No, God gives people that passion. He puts it inside them. He fires people to do things. But what it is saying is, don't just dash in and then think about it afterwards. You know, do your homework biblically, do it on the social and economic, political fronts, compare what's going on here in other nations, all the other things that are necessary as part of building up the picture. But then on the wisdom side, you might be wise just to ask one or two older and more experienced Christians what they think about it, just get their view before you then commit yourself to 10, 20, 30 years of work. But don't lose the passion in the process. Just hold it there while you check it out.
Great. Thanks very much.